Hi guys and welcome back to LPJ Models. In this video I'm going to be building the Tamiya 1/35th scale Kettenkraftrad. This is a fairly new tool release from Tamiya, being released earlier this year. And I gotta say, it looks really promising. As we go through the sprue shots, I want to give you a quick channel update. So this is going to be the last video I'll be doing on my phone, as I managed to save a few pennies and get a nice PC. And I didn't stop there, I had to buy a new camera as well. It's a Sony a6400 and the quality is awesome, and I can't wait for you guys to see it. I want to give a big shout out and a huge thanks to Modelling Weekly for helping me to choose this camera. He's got an absolutely quality YouTube channel and you should really check it out. There'll be a link to Modelling Weekly's channel in the description. Also, I recently had a really cool interview with the Plastic Posse Podcast. The Triple P run a really tight ship and produce some really quality content, so I highly recommend you go and check those guys out. There will be a link to the Plastic Posse Podcast in the description below. And that just about wraps up my channel update. Also, things have been a bit hectic on my side at the moment, hence the lack of videos, but I'm getting back into the game and you will see more content soon. And without further ado, let's get on with the build. Tamiya mouldings are usually pretty good. Tamiya new tool mouldings are absolutely amazing. There was very little cleanup needed on this kit. Really just some sprue gates that needed tidying up with an 800 grit Infinity sanding stick. The engineering on this kit is also really cleverly done. The way everything fits together is logical and simple. All of the plastic parts on this kit were glued together with my favourite VMS fast setting styrene cement decanted into an old Tamiya bottle. Two photo etch parts are supplied for the grills on the engine cover. This also comes with a plastic former to make sure they're bent to the correct shape. Once the engine parts have been brutalised into shape, they were glued in place with VMS Flexi 5K CA for photo etch. Of course applied with the most high-tech of implements, the mighty toothpick. If you're careful with your gluing, you can leave the engine hatch posable, which is a really nice feature. Another nice inclusion in the kit is the engine. This is nicely detailed, but it could probably benefit from some wiring. I chose to do mine out of the box this time. After the simple running gear construction was complete, it was time to add the tracks. These are supplied as link and length, but the track pads come separately. This is not a big issue though, as the track pads on the sprues are spaced perfectly to glue straight onto the runs. Once the track pads were applied, it was time to remove the excess sprue and give them a light sand to clean them up. The front mudguard was moulded in 2 halves. This left an unsightly seam that needed cleaning up. This was filled with superglue and then sanded smooth. The front wheel is posable because of a small pin. It's slightly fiddly to get in, but it works brilliantly. With the main sub-assemblies complete, it was time to start work on the trailer. This comes as a multi-part tub assembly, and as you'd expect, it went together with no problems. The next job was to assemble the figures. These are excellently moulded. Tamiya have done a great job. They're also the only figures I've done that have got locator tabs. For styrene figures, these are fantastic. I really like the locator tabs on these figures. Usually when assembling figures you've got to keep test fitting until you get them exactly right. But with these you can be confident that they're going to fit without any messing about. Okay, let's get on with the painting. All of the sub-assemblies, the body, the tracks, the figures and the trailer were primed with Mr. Surfacer 1500 black, thinned with Mr. Leveling Thinner. This was thinned at a ratio of around 40% paint to 60% thinner. This was then sprayed around 15 psi, making sure to get in all the nooks and crannies. For the base colour on the Kettenkrad, I used AK Real Colour Dunkelgelb, thinned again with Mr. Leveling Thinner. This was mottled over the base layer of black, leaving some shadowy areas and building up highlights with more opaque paint. For some added highlights and tonal variation, I mixed in some MRP clear dope linen bleached into my Dunkelgelb mix. This was then very lightly sprayed at around 10 psi to reinforce the highlights on the model. I then increased the amount of MRP clear dope linen in the mix and sprayed on some extreme highlights. For the camo colours, I decided to use MRP. I started with their red brown. To make sure the camo shapes were crisp, I sprayed these really close, at around 8 psi. As you can see here with the red brown, the paint flow kept getting interrupted, which was really frustrating. I tried countering this by thinning the MRP further with Mr. Leveling Thinner, but that didn't change much, so I just had to live with it. Once I was happy with the red brown, it was time to move on to the olive green. Luckily, this sprayed a lot nicer. To lightly blend in the camouflage colours, I sprayed over a filter of the base colour, aka Real Colour Dunkelgelb, thinned with 90% thinner. With the camo complete, it was time to start working on some of the details. I started in the engine. The engine block was given a base colour of black and then dry brushed with Citadel Ironbreaker. I don't use dry brushing very often, but for such a small part in a dark area, I wanted the contrast. The air filter and piston block were chipped with Vallejo German Sea Black Brown applied with a coarse sponge. The engine block was then connected to the transmission housing and cockpit floor. Once this had been chipped in the same manner as before, it was all given a wash of Abteilung 502 sepia thinned with Universal Weathering Carrier. The engine assembly, and then the seat painted in a satin black colour, was then installed into the tub. All the rubber sections on the running gear were painted with a mixture of Vallejo black mixed with sunny skin tone. The sunny skin tone just takes away some of the starchness of the black, making the rubber look a bit more natural. The tracks were given a muddy grey base coat of a mix of Tamiya medium grey, AK real colour dark grey and AK real colour dark brown. This muddy grey colour is always a great base for weathering later on. The track pads were then carefully brush painted with the same light black mix from earlier. The fabric seats on the back of the Kettenkrad were base painted with AK real colour Sand 7K. They were then given highlights with Abteilung 502 dust, which were blended in with a soft brush. The seats were then given some shadows with the new MVP in my oil collection, Abteilung 502 Sepia. The 3 decals for the dashboard were cut away from their carrier film. I then used VMS decal set and fix to make sure they firmly adhered to the model, and used VMS softener to make sure they snuggled down into any of the raised details. The Kettenkrad was then given its first layer of chipping. I used Vallejo German camouflage beige mixed with ivory to represent a lightened, chipped version of the base colour. This was dabbed on lightly with a coarse filter sponge. For the darker layer of chips, I used VMS Chip and Nick CN01, a dark red-brown colour. This was applied very carefully in the middle of the lighter chips with an Artis Opus 20 Kolinsky sable. I sealed in the chipping with a layer of VMS Satin Varnish HD. This was to serve as a base layer for oil weathering, which started with, and you probably guessed it, a wash of Abteilung 502 Sepia, thinned with Universal Weathering Carrier. I wanted to add some dry mud to the model, so I mixed up some sand and brown earth VMS pigments. To add some more texture and a dried grass effect, I used some old needles from an asparagus fern. This was then mixed with some dry step splashes effects from MIG. I used a tatty old brush to apply this to the lower areas of the model, behind the running gear, in the wheel arches and on the underside. The road wheels and tracks were then glued into place. This assembly was then given a thinned, washed version of the previous mud mix. When this had dried, I speckled on some of the dry step splashes effect straight out of the bottle onto the model. This was done in a controlled manner as I didn't want to go overboard. I also focused on areas that would logically accumulate more splashes and dirt. With the main paintwork on the vehicle done, it was time to start painting the figures. I decided to use some AK 3rd Gen acrylics for the main base coat of the figures. I haven't used these before and I had a bottle lying around, so I thought this was a prime opportunity. This was thinned about 40 paint to 60 thinner with VMS Airbrush Thinner 2.0. They sprayed really nicely and left a nice smooth layer. To add some highlights to the figure, I mixed in some Vallejo Golden Olive to the AK Field Grey Base No. 1. This was sprayed mainly from above to pick up the raised details. If you're interested in seeing a more in-depth video about figures, check out my Painting DAC Figures in 135 video. Check the link in the description. The flesh areas were based in Vallejo brown sand. A mix of green-grey and ivory Vallejo colours was then used to pick out the whites of the eyes. Using a pure white can look too stark and unrealistic. Also, don't worry if you don't do this very accurately. You can close the eyes later with your base flesh colour. I painted in an iris colour with German Sea black brown. Any excess eye white and iris colour was then painted over with Vallejo brown sand. I introduced some highlights to the figures to make them look more dynamic with a mix of sunny skin tone and light flesh. This was thinned, about 70% water and 30% paint. I always find figure painting, especially faces, a back and forth process. I'll often find myself reapplying highlights and shadows until I'm finally happy with the result. When the face is in the earlier stages of painting, it can look garish and unrealistic, but just persist with more layers until you get the balance right. Here I'm adding in some shadows with a mix of Vallejo sunny skin tone and hull red. A final, more extreme layer of highlights was painted in with Vallejo light flesh heavily thinned with water. To add some shading to the uniform colour, I mixed in some black with my AK Gen 3 Field Grey. This was built up in light, transparent layers until I was happy with the depth that I achieved. This was thinned at around 70% water to 30% paint. For some more highlights, I mixed in some Vallejo Deep Yellow with the AK Field Grey. This was thinned to a slightly more paint heavy ratio at around 60% thinner to 40% paint. This mix was painted over any raised areas or parts of the uniform that might catch the light. The details, pouches and straps of the uniform were picked out with various Vallejo colours. I didn't go into too much detail here, as my previously mentioned DAC figure video is pretty comprehensive. And this brings us to the end of my 135th Tamiya Kettenkrad video with its accompanying figures. Before we get to the final images, I want to give a huge shout out and a massive thanks to my patrons for supporting me and my work. You guys are awesome and your support is very much appreciated. Thank you. Also, don't forget to check out the awesome Plastic Posse Podcast for some great scale modelling podcast goodness. And also don't forget to head over to Modelling Weekly's channel and check him out. I'm James from LPJ Models. See you in the next one.